Hi there. I'm Michael John Williams, and I'm Associate Professor at the Maxwell School of Citizenship and Public Affairs at Syracuse University. I'm also teaching at New York University's program in International Relations this summer. I'm going to speak to you for a few minutes about President Macron of France's recent trip to China. It created quite a kerfuffle because of some comments he made, and they sort of illustrate the underlying dynamics of great power conflict and cooperation, which is what I'll be teaching about this summer. So Macron went on a bilateral trip to Beijing, where he was feted by the Chinese government and treated exceptionally well. And he spoke on the record with reporters and talked about getting how the European Union doesn't want to get dragged into crises that are not its own. And this was, of course, meant vis-a-vis Taiwan and the growing pressure between Beijing and Washington. And of course, Washington is working to try and get more allies on side and to present a firm line against what they see as aggressive practices by China in the Asia-Pacific region that go against international law. And will supposedly upset the liberal international order as it's known in Washington. And so France was sort of pushing back against that and was arguing in favor of European strategic autonomy. He didn't, say that they wouldn't come to the aid of Taiwan or that it wasn't respecting international law, but that Europe needed to be more capable, didn't need to be dependent on the United States, needed to think for itself. And of course, this created a lot of blowback, both in Europe and in France, and of course in Washington. And so I want to draw out a few key points from this trip that highlight some of the challenges with European strategic autonomy and the nature of the relationship between Europe, European nations, and China, as well as Europe, European nations, the United States, and the United States and China. So the first takeaway is that the European Union is a player on the world stage, but it is still not the primary player in Europe. The primary player are nation states. And the European states, including France, perhaps principally France in some ways, continually acts against the interests of the European Union. So rather than having that red phone to call on the desk that Henry Kissinger once said, if I need to call Europe, who do I call? There are still many phones which need to be called. And you can see this in the recent trips. So the German Chancellor, Olaf Scholz, went not too long ago to Beijing on a bilateral trip to promote German trade and investment and German relations. He did not bring along an EU team or EU delegation. Now, the French president went along, and at the same time, Ursula von der Leyen went to Beijing. The French did invite her. Now, however, the French did not bring her on the French jet that flew the president to France. They did not treat her, she was not feted the same way by the Chinese, and essentially was sort of relegated to second-class status, okay? When Macron had the full rollout, the bilateral meetings, the proper reception, Ursula von der Leyen flew commercial airline. She had to go through regular security. There was no sort of pomp and circumstance, and she went home exactly the same way. And so what you really see here is China recognizing and playing against these international realities in Europe and elevating the bilateral relationships at the expense of the European Union relationship. If the European Union really wanted to have a coherent strategic autonomous posture, it should have been von der Leyen who went on behalf of the countries of Europe, accompanied perhaps by the French president or the German chancellor, not the other way around. And so no matter what France and Macron say about wanting to have a stronger, more autonomous Europe, what they ultimately mean is a stronger, more autonomous Europe in the mold of France. And this brings us to our second problem here, which is that this has been a consistent vision of some Europeans since the inception of the European coal and steel community, but at least since the 1960s. In 1966, France left the integrated military command structure of NATO because Charles de Gaulle believed that France should have its own sovereignty and that Europe should be more autonomous from the United States. And this has been an ever perpetual struggle. Now, the problem with this is that the Europeans, again, there's no consensus, particularly Germany, which was successfully reoriented away from looking east to looking west, has been a diehard transatlanticist country. German power has been made palatable, in particular through NATO. And so German politicians, although there's a segment that are amenable to the idea of strategic autonomy, are very much wedded to the relationship with the United States and the US role in Europe. Now, that's been getting shakier in recent years, especially with the Trump administration's behavior and posturing. And that's caused allies in Europe sort of question American credibility and reliability in Europe. But it still hasn't divorced the continent, and particularly Germany, from this reality. And there was actually an open letter that was published in the Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung and the New York Times from a bunch of German foreign policy professionals during the Trump administration that's saying, despite everything that was happening, America was still the indispensable ally for Germany, and that Germany would actually sort of pick up the liberal democratic mantle until America came to its senses, right? So that illustrates the strength of the bond. So an autonomous Europe in opposition to the United States won't really fly in Beijing. More importantly, it won't fly on the eastern flank of the European Union. In countries such as Poland, Czech Republic, Slovakia, the Baltics, they ultimately believe only in the American security guarantee. Now, that doesn't mean to say that they wouldn't have underwritten more European capability development within the European Union, which would be a good thing for the United States because it wants allies to do more. And it has played a double game in trying to split allies apart, right? Sort of saying, buy American, and we want into this European project, rather than letting the Europeans get on with certain issues. But the reality there is that Macron's statements, even if he didn't mean to, seem to cast European strategic autonomy against the United States. And so what this does is drives a massive wedge between those countries on the eastern flank of the European Union, and as well Germany, not to mention Denmark and the Nordics, who are also generally very pro-American, and will so ultimately undermine the project of European strategic autonomy. And so this creates very real problems. Now, the final thought here, of course, is that the Chinese are playing all of this up because it's in the Chinese interest to keep Europe as individual national actors within a European Union economic context, but to try and play them against their American allies. And so this doesn't help the relationship, it strains it, and it ultimately undermines European credibility vis-a-vis the United States. And this is going to be problematic going forward, especially if there's a change of administration and a return to a Republican White House, which may, again, question European credibility. And the bigger issue here is, of course, that despite pledges to increase defense spending within the NATO context, which would ultimately benefit European autonomy in any case, those net pledges have not been met. And indeed, a lot of countries in Europe are now again questioning whether or not they need to spend that amount of money because Russia has done so poorly in the war against Ukraine, right? And so now they're saying, actually, look, this is not such a major threat. And the US is, of course, backfilling European capability once again. So you have this perpetuating of European defense dependency. So European strategic autonomy and capability development would be a great thing. It is definitely in the interest of the United States. It is definitely in the interest of the European Union. It is definitely in the interest of the rule of law internationally. But ultimately, the Europeans, and in this case, Macron, acted against that, right? And I'll leave you with a final note. There was recently a piece in War on the Rocks talking about the reasons for lack of European defense spending. And it was a good piece, but what that piece neglected was the fact that European defense industry is still predicated on national champions. And that ultimately is, again, what undercuts the development. And one of the principal things that undercut the development, there are several others, but one of the principal things is that they promote their national champions at the expense of other international options, right? And so what they need to do is focus on coordination and sort of integration of the European defense industry, right, to develop those capabilities. When I was working at Airbus Military many years ago, we were trying to sell the Eurofighter Typhoon, which is an Airbus product, pan-European product, to India. And the main competition was Dassault, and the French government flew to India to compete against the European Airbus project and ultimately won it because they were able to offer nuclear cooperation with India as well. And so here you see the very real realities that were once again on display in the French president's visit to China at play in the defense industry. So although the United States is engaged and important to Europe, there should be European autonomy, but that has to start with Europe. It has to start with a coherent European vision for the role in the world. It has to start with stepping back of nation states in the European Union and a promotion of the European Union, and it has to start with consolidation in the European defense industry. That's some of the stuff we're going to be talking about this summer in the course. I hope you found this analysis interesting, and thanks for listening.